Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another Amoda Maa podcast. Before I begin, I'd just like to say hello to Amoda. Hello.
Hello.
So today we are going to explore an article, a short article that I found of Amoda's, written. I'm not sure when, she's not sure when, but sometime in the last couple of years. And although there's always an evolution of Amoda Maa's kind of way of speaking about things, certainly there's still a timelessness to what is being communicated by her. So I thought it would be interesting today to read the article, and then I can ask Amoda some questions based on the words she's used. So let's jump straight into this. Freedom begins when the cracks appear. Freedom begins when the cracks in our inner world appear. When it dawns on us that every belief, opinion, hope, expectation, and need is built on shifting sands. When the psychological structures that uphold the self-identity based on inherited beliefs are seen as a cover-up of our innermost truth. When the knot of ego starts to untangle itself, because holding it together is exhausting and futile. When our inner world starts falling apart, often triggered or amplified by the outer world seeming to fall apart. We can finally meet life from the unknown. In meeting life from the unknown, the mind can gently bounce back from its grip on reality and fall into its true home as beingness. It's a willingness to meet reality without an argument, without resistance, without grasping for certainty. It's the willingness to fall, moment to moment, into silent awareness. It reminds me that it's very possibly a passage, although maybe rewritten from the book, Falling Open, Inner World, Falling Apart, because it has got that kind of texture or that sort of feel to it, which would fit with maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember when you wrote that book. Quite a powerful piece of writing, I feel. I mean, everything that you write is quite a powerful piece of writing, and sometimes I don't think you realize for people quite how powerful this kind of stuff is. So we're going to explore some of this, and I'm going to ask you some questions, and then we're going to see where it goes. Just launching in off the kind of the top of it in a way, you say we can finally meet life from the unknown. What is this unknown you're talking about?
Essentially, that's referring to the inner space of silence. When we say unknown, for many people, that means or conjures up an idea that the unknown is something to do with the future. And that's a scary prospect. Whilst it's true that the future is unknown, although we don't like to really accept that, to meet life from the unknown is possibly very scary, because it means that everything's uncertain, everything's chaotic, we live in a random universe, and so on. And this is all about the future. It's also about the material world, the world of form. And that's not what this is referring to. To meet life from the unknown is to meet life without the veils of projected hope and fear that we impose upon reality. For many people, and for many of us who've evolved beyond it, if you like, or woken up out of that dream state of past and future and projection, in our own lifetimes, we've not been conscious of the fact that we don't see reality as it is, the immediate reality, but we see through the veils of expectation, hope, fear, agenda. So we're never really operating or perceiving from the clear awareness. And it's like the windows are clear. We see through, dusty windows, dirty windows, veiled windows, curtained windows. And those veils are based on our past experience and our conditioning, if you like, or on our inherited beliefs. And there's a kind of projected certainty of how my life is going to be, how the next moment will be, how tomorrow will be, how, it's infused with our hopes, our dreams, our expectations, our agendas, an imaginary outcome, all kinds of beliefs that overlay reality. To meet life from the unknown is to come naked to this moment, to see nakedly, to feel nakedly, to taste the texture of this moment nakedly. It's like being empty inside, but it's not an empty that is a vacuous empty. It's just simply empty of the many egoic structures that seemingly make up our lives, but are not reality. They're a kind of fabricated sense of self and a fabricated sense of life. And that creates a kind of tightness, a contracted, limited aperture through which we experience life. To meet life from the unknown is naked, it's open, it's empty of all these egoic strategies, and it's fully in presence. So it's very, if you like, innocent and pure and direct. So it's not about being afraid of the future or learning to trust the future because it's unknown. It's really an inner unknownness. It's like the self doesn't have a position it stands on.
This is obviously, what everything that you've written, speaks to what you're talking of, because would you say that the self, the conditioned self, the reason it's difficult for people to understand what this unknown is because, we're habituated to grasp and clutch at that which we think we know, for a million different reasons, most of which are based in fear and control. And that when we posited with this possibility of meeting life from the unknown, that it does bring up all of these. It confounds the mind in many ways, doesn't it? It might frighten the emotional mind, but it confounds us, doesn't it? Because of everything that you were just saying.
The kind of I don't know if it's a paradox or a mystery or something that cannot be actually explained
Yeah.
rationally, is that this that's being spoken of cannot really be spoken to the self. Because when the absolute, yeah, when the self hears it, it's scary. It doesn't make sense. It's a paradigm that is unknown, actually, and therefore it might freeze the self. So it's not. We have to be careful here. It's not an imperative. It's not a command to the self, and it's not a method to the self. It's not like, well, you should do this, and therefore it will get you to some other more peaceful, happier, blissful state, because it doesn't speak to the self. It's this that is that's spoken of through these words is only known, yeah, recognized, understood, and lived once the ego identity has come undone. Once we have awoken out of the dream. I mean, I would not have understood those words, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, or whatever, 25 years ago. Yeah. But in awakening, it is absolutely the case. It's absolutely how it is. So then one may ask, well, why even say these things? Because
So,
they're
why say these things?
well, there you are, you said it. Why say these things? Because there's a natural impulse when the prison of self has come undone to speak from that place. Not as a command, not as a methodology, not as a process, not as something to take on as a kind of learning, something I have to do, but really as a taster, a little glimpse, if you like, of the possibility of freedom. Because deep in our souls, if you like, in the depth of our beings, we all yearn for this. We all yearn for freedom from the prison of self. And really, there is a kind of tipping point, or one reaches a kind of edge where perhaps that process is already taking place. And then these words might give some solace or be an invitation.
Yeah. So, uh, pursuing this a little bit, is the fact that it's there's a lure here. As spiritual teachers do this, and I remember I didn't understand a word that anybody was saying for about 20 years ago. But I know that there was a draw. There was something that was being spoken of, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that there was something beautiful within it. Is one part, yeah. So there's a kind of fire that draws the moth towards it, if you like. And then the other aspect is that all the things that you talk about and all the things, the questions that we're going to get to, what I'm trying to describe the unknown, which is kind of absurd, really, isn't it? Meeting reality without an argument, falling into silent awareness, all of these have the capacity to confuse the mind of the self. And what I'm asking you is is that a good thing? That's we're looking for a certain amount
I
of
don't
confusion.
think,
I'm saying it positively.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. I don't think that anything is designed to confuse the mind. It's not some kind of
Yeah. You're not the Joker.
brainwashing, yeah, or, yeah, or mind control or anything like that. So it's not designed to, but by its very nature, because it speaks to that which is beyond conceptual mind, it will confuse mind. if you're listening from mind. And, I've told this story many times, and I'll say it again briefly. When I was seeking and was in India mostly, and other places, and listened to enlightened teachers and listened to Osho's discourses particularly, my mind was scrambled. I didn't understand a word they said. I couldn't follow the logic of any sentence or any phrase that was said. And I'd done a lot of spiritual and esoteric and metaphysical and psychological reading and understanding. And this I couldn't grasp. The mind couldn't grasp it. But it did draw me. It drew me in because it's the frequency of it that spoke. That's something we can't manufacture. It's just, yeah. So it's not about understanding the words on a logical, rational level, although there is some sense to them, of course. But what's being said or what's being pointed to with those words. So yes, it's a good thing if the mind gets confused. I mean, when I started meditation practice many, many years ago in the middle of my psychology training, my mind got completely confused. It's the beginning. It's the beginning. It's not the end. You don't stay confused.
I think that the end is the collapse of the paradox of one side or another side. The idea of the self and the enlightened self and stuff is the end is the collapse of those two things as they dissolve into one. But at first, there's the dealing with the sort of rigid idea of the self, isn't it? And somehow the light, if you like, needs to get in to us in order to start breaking up that which you've talked about here. Yeah, freedom begins when the cracks in our inner world appear. That's kind of what we're speaking to here. And just to conclude that little bit of the conversation, I remember when I first met you and you took me around because I wasn't well versed in such things. But you took me around to various spiritual teachers, and I sat there. It was tough. I didn't know what they were speaking about. I didn't like what they were speaking about. It brought up a nasty resistance in me and a complete contempt because I didn't understand it. And I was wanting to get out of that door as fast as possible back to what I thought was known, even though I was suffering terribly mentally and emotionally. And it was only really because of you that I kept, that this momentum started to build up. And that seems really quite laughable now as the cliff eroded. But I can certainly, I sympathize with the one that holds on, because it does feel quite threatening on a certain existential level.
I mean, my my response to that is, if you're not drawn, not you, speaking to in a general way, if you're not drawn to it, don't 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 don't. Like I said, it's not a command. It only happens, it only speaks, even if it's a little confusing or whatever, when we're ready, when we're ripe. Obviously, you were, because you came into my life. So you were
I was, babe.
yeah. So whether you resisted it or not, you still were present. You were still here. You're still here. You were still here. You still are here, and so on. So in general, as a generalization, whoever we're speaking to here, whoever's listening to this, if you're not drawn to it, if it doesn't speak to your soul, if there isn't a little chink in the armor for this to get through, for the light to enter, then it's not the right time.
Yeah. I think that most people who are listening to this are ready, but are also, maybe, look, just always looking for the cracks to open up more and more and more, and that's really why we do these podcasts. In a sense, the teaching is the thing, but these podcasts are a sort of more informal, in a sense, way of speaking to the nuances of what some of this paradoxical nature of awakening kind of means. So, okay, thank you for all that. Let me just move on to the second question, which in a way you've answered, but we still need to kind of keep talking about it. What is this meeting reality without an argument? And yeah, so I mean, let's leave it there. I'm going to throw that out to you and see where it lands.
I think the bridge to answering that question or exploring that question is to put it in the context, to bridge it with what we've just been saying, which is that the ripeness for this invitation of freedom, which is what it is, doesn't come the way that we might imagine it, like when I'm ready, when I'm strong enough, when I don't know, I've achieved something in my life and I'm ready to explore this, or when I have the luxury of time and space. It doesn't come in that way. It comes usually in a circumstance, a situation in life, externally, seemingly, something that happens in our lives that has an impact internally. Maybe the loss of something, loss of a relationship, or loss of a job, or whatever it might be, where we had been invested in that as part of our identity. We've drawn our sense of self from that relationship, from that job, from that career path, whatever it might be. I mean, that's just what happens in life. And when that gets challenged or rocked or taken away from us because circumstances have changed, and especially if it's unexpected and happens very suddenly, that's actually the time. That's actually the time when this invitation of freedom can really enter, can really be received, even though that's the time where we feel like it's all gone wrong and I'm not ready for this and this has got nothing to do with freedom and so on. It's the opposite. So that relates to the question, what does it mean to meet reality without an argument? Well, it's in those times when something suddenly shifts, or we lose something changes, we're challenged in some way, and then that brings up fear, maybe regret, anger, insecurity, despair, loneliness, whatever it might be that is instigated or catalyzed by that circumstance. That's when we unconsciously resist that feeling, we resist that circumstance, we try to either change it or try and control reality. We panic, endless emotional and mental strategies. And also we resist or reject the actual feeling state that's been catalyzed here. Maybe we feel broken in some way, broken open or broken down, or whatever it might be. And then we fight against that internally. We don't want to feel that, so we may go and distract ourselves by, I don't know, whatever the distraction might be, a social distraction or a recreational distraction or whatever it might be, or finding another relationship immediately and so on, or, going shopping. All the distractions that can happen. So to fill up that hole, that that loss, that, if you like, desolate internal place, a space. So we numb out, we control, we distract, we contract, we become a poor me or a victim of the circumstance. These are all mental and emotional strategies to avoid meeting reality as it is. And that's an argument. We're arguing with reality. And that simply perpetuates the formation of the ego structure, the prison of ego. Me, the self, against life, against this circumstance. This circumstance has happened, this challenge has happened, this loss has happened. I don't want it, I don't like it, I don't like how it makes me feel. And so it's a thing out there that I'm going to change, or I'm going to run away from, or I'm going to try and overpower, or whatever, yeah? And so we've actually retracted into the prison of self. And whilst this might be band-aid for a short time, it's A, not an effective way of dealing with life, but B, that is an opportunity for the undoing of the self. Yeah, the undoing of the ego structure, which then allows a whole new dimension of life and life's opportunities and offerings, if you like, to become available to us that are not available when we're meeting it from a contracted, limited self. So ending the argument with what is, with reality, is the same as meeting reality from the unknown, is the same as meeting reality from inner silence. Yeah? Inner silence is empty of the narratives that say this shouldn't be happening, this shouldn't have happened to me, I'm a bad person because it's happened, or I'm not good enough or strong enough or lucky enough or whatever it might be, or I'm going to be stronger than this, and all of that, the narratives that take place. It's silent, but silence doesn't mean passivity, because that's the fear, yeah, from the self's point of view. Well, if there's silence within in response to this, that means I'm just going to be passive, and yeah, and that's not the truth of it either. It's out of silence that true intelligent action takes place.
Thank you. Okay. The what I hear, in this beautiful these beautiful words that you're saying, is like the self is in many ways built on that. And we've been working with people recently, I think this has come up, stands on the ground of this shouldn't be happening, this shouldn't have happened, this shouldn't be happening. Yeah. And there's the kind of core of the argument, the resistance that the self stands on. Correct?
Yes.
And what I'm hearing you saying is there in that very intimate, potentially intimate moment, to not take that for granted, because it is happening, because it has happened. And there's the argument. To argue with things that have happened or are happening is insane on a certain level, understandable on the level of self. But what I hear you saying is there's the opportunity.
That's right. It is insanity because it is happening. It has happened, and you can't. Yeah, it's not in your power to change that. And first of all, to accept that it's happening. It doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean that you have only positive or comfortable feelings, because this is also relating to what is being felt. I mean, I can cite many examples from the end of my PhD journey to the end of a long-term relationship to, I don't know, all sorts of things.
Me
The death
too.
of my mother or whatever it might be, you too. And none of those were comfortable. I mean, some of them were heartbreaking and desolate. Internal landscapes were revealed. But there's the invitation, even in that, to not argue with it. Because everything, the darkest arena within, is the invitation to the light.
This is the knife edge. This is part of the razor's edge. This because it may well feel, as you just cited your experiences, and I've got my own experiences, that it may feel like you're going to die. It may feel that terrifying that the self is going to die. And that's always a good reason to hang on even more.
But that's the that's the beauty. The self is going to die.
That's right. This is very like Neo in the Matrix. I'm sorry to bring that up again, but it is very like Neo in the Matrix when he's unplugged and he's falling through. And it's like, here it is. He is being unplugged. Death is happening on that level. It doesn't mean what it seems to mean. It's like, see what I mean? I'm talking about the frisson of that actual moment, if you like, which is not just one moment, it's over time, maybe. But this is the razor's edge that we're talking of.
Yeah. From the point of view of the self is going to die, and therefore it clings to everything that is known. It clings to resistance. It clings to the argument and clings to the avoidance, and so on and so on. But it's not the self as this form that's going to die. I mean, obviously, we are still here. Yeah, the body doesn't die. It needs something more than that to die. Yeah, the body doesn't die. The mind doesn't die. Not in the way that we think. Existence doesn't stop. We still exist. But what dies, and we use that word, but it is a death. But it's an undoing of the self-fabricated ideas of who I am. In other words, who I think I am. Yeah? These are all mental constructs and emotional constructs, or emotional strategies to uphold those mental constructs. These come undone. And these are like prison bars through which we experience life, and have got so used to those prison bars that we can't even see that they're there. But in this death that we're speaking of, in this undoing that we're speaking of, those prison bars come to be seen, if you like, at least experienced energetically, as the prison bars. And it's only in freedom, the freedom of clear seeing, the freedom of pure seeing, the freedom of the whole structure of self, or at least some structure of self, coming undone, that we realize that those prison bars were ever there in the first place. That's why you can't really speak to the self. You can only speak of the freedom and say, it's okay, there is freedom.
That's beautiful. I love I love the prison bars, because the seeing of the prison bars is the glue. That's the glue that holds the whole construct together. The idea, the belief of the prison bars. Belief itself is the prison bars. And the glue, as you're saying, starts to kind of come undone. And what was patently obvious is revealed as being patently obvious. Yes. Right?
So it's not a painful death. It's a beautiful death. Because at the same time that, let's say, death takes place, if we're using that, we're using it symbolically, right? There's a rebirth. You're reborn into freedom. You're reborn into the light of presence, the light of true awareness. And you realize that you never were that you thought you were. I was never the victim that I thought I was. I didn't
Right.
really even know that I was operating as the victim until the prison bars came undone. I mean, there was a kind of sense. I mean, I'd done so much psychological work, so I kind of was familiar with my sort of internal constellation, if you like. And I always felt powerless, small, and everything that results from that. Yeah, whether it was in the world or in relationship or having a voice or any of that. So it was always my kind of core story that I wasn't, that I was small. I was I wasn't, I had no power. I don't mean power on a worldly level, but I didn't have that either. But internally. And this was really being a victim. It was a victim identity. I was at the behest, if you like, of life, and not just of life, of God. So then there's the attempt to earn my brownie points so that I could be loved by God and by others or whatever it might be. And so this was just an ongoing, if you like, situation that drove my life, but not knowing anything else. But it's only when the prison bars came undone, or I saw them for the illusion that they were, that that whole thing just vanished. It just vanished. And I experienced life completely differently. Completely differently. The whole idea of a victim was laughable. Yes, stuff happens in life. I'm not denying that stuff happens to us as children, in aspects of society and so on. I'm not talking about it on that level, on the materialistic level. Talking about it internally as an energetic sort of, knot that drives many, many people.
So the story of your life up until then, and I know you had a tumultuous, confusing, kind of wounded, weird, almost story of your human life. I remember you telling me, and it was confounding how kind of weird or quixotic it was. And it did play you for a victim. Yeah, it did create a certain victim kind of mentality or emotional stuckness, and all of that came undone,
It
correct?
all came undone. It all came undone. That didn't change my personality in the sense of I didn't suddenly become a super confident, super powerful person. It wasn't on the level of personhood. It's like the person vanished in some ways. It
And
was
as the
just a
person vanished, what then? Well, then what?
what was left.
Well, then what? But is this what we're talking about? Then what is falling into silent awareness?
Well, the person is obviously still here, but the person becomes like a gossamer thin appearance through which life can function. My experience of this person is very different to how it used to be. And that's not because this person has been perfected or manipulated or fixed, or it's not on that level. It's become irrelevant, and yet it still functions. Yeah?
Is there's a lightness of touch where there used to be a heaviness of identification?
Yes, there's no identification with the self other than the basic functions. Yeah. Therefore, it's experienced as simply a light, permeable. I hesitate to even call it a vehicle, but a sort of vessel, a portal. The self is experienced as a permeable portal through which consciousness, awareness, can experience knowing itself or knowing itself, yes, and the movement of life takes place.
So, before we move on a little bit, I'm going to close up at some point, but moving on. How then, when the self is held so lightly, but we live in such a self-defined world where the self still is, it's not, here you are, as you said, you're still, you know, what happened? Because previous to this, and for most people, of course, when the insults of life come, when the movement of life is always high and low, left and right, yin and yang, yeah, in the nature of impermanence. Well, let's call them just the insults of life come. Where do they, how does Amoda deal with them? Where do they land in you when they're difficult issues?
Are you talking? I love this word, insults. Of course, the self is always insulted by by.
I'm talking about anything that disturbs potentially, the self seeks to create passivity, usually for most people, create safety. So then the tax bill comes, somebody yells at you in the thing, somebody steals your car, a hurricane comes, your partner says you're a whatever. Not that I'd do that, of course, but these are the things that I mean by insults. It's a broad term.
Well, there are small insults and there are larger insults, right?
I'm talking about where do they land in
where
you,
do they land? Yes.
And what ripples? How do you deal with the ripples of the phenomenal world as it enters Amoda Maa?
Well, that's why I differentiate between the small ones and the large ones, or the ones that are, if you like, momentary, passing through, and the ones that do have a lasting or have a real impact on the movement or of one's life, and that's actually quite different. There's the ones that really have no meaning, like somebody honks their car horn when you've obviously not done anything wrong, or they're in a hurry and they're just being impatient or something like that, or somebody crossing the road, or you didn't see that red light and stopped fast enough and somebody's very cross with you. I don't know. Minor irritations of life. Or the cashier is grumpy that day or whatever it might be. These pass through either as minor irritations or just as ripples on the surface. There's no mostly, I would say, and it's hard to know because it depends what it is and when it's happening, but mostly there's no reaction to that. But a ripple might pass through, a ripple of irritation or something, or just an energy. Yeah, somebody honks their horn, they're going, yeah. There's an energy. That's okay. That's okay. It doesn't have to become a narrative where you end up chasing them down the road and saying, "How dare you do that to me?"
You're in America. Don't do that.
So there's minor irritations that
it's
mostly
the major ones that I'm
have no impact.
about,
Yes,
really.
okay. So the major ones. Okay, the tax bill. I don't know, you have to move home, or I don't know, some more, a loss of some kind, or a shock of some kind. Of course, as human beings, which we still are, permeable or not, there will be a texture, yeah? A texture
Yeah.
will take place, a surprise, shock, something. But again, it's more of an energetic texture, yeah? From that place, one, it's not a, the victim identity doesn't
Mm. Yeah.
navigate the problem, because the victim identity isn't there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's simply an intelligent response to life. Something needs
Yeah.
to be dealt with. Something changes. Maybe it causes discomfort, of course. Maybe it causes, some action needs to be taken, or no action. Yeah. But as well as that, there's, whilst in the immediacy of it, there may be, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
what is
I
this
understand.
about? What am I going to do? So we wait. There's a pause, there's an inner silence, and then you do what you have to do. But I have to say this, everything that happens, every challenge, every calamity, every tragedy, every whatever it might be, is always an opportunity for growth, even though it doesn't seem like it
Mm.
at the time. So there is, at the same time as perhaps an immediate, oh my gosh, what's this? What's this about? Yeah, it's not very welcome, but let's see what it's about. Always there is the bigger picture that's always here, or the wider perspective that's always here, that actually this is for growth.
Mm.
Whether it's a financial issue, a relationship issue, it's always an invitation for something either needs to be let go of, something either is falling away, something new is emerging from within this, and it's just, yeah. So every circumstance offers that opportunity. I'm not sure if war does. Let me say that. War
Mm.
is a tragedy on a level that is,
Well,
I don't know if there's growth through that on a personal level,
I,
although, yeah.
I mean, getting specific. I want to come back to what you said, but getting specific. War, to this heart. War is failure. War is a complete failure. Yeah, I
Mm.
don't, regardless of the sides and the suffering and the horror, and there is always horror and there is always suffering. But war to me is a failure of humanity.
Mm.
And in that sense, it's utterly heart-rendering, that we have to resort to, and we feel we have to justify, and and all that. And I don't really want to speak any more than that about it, but I do see it as failure. That's why I'm not sure. The only way to, yeah.
Yeah, and may I just say, on a personal level, yeah, that
Yeah.
I agree with that 100%. But just on a personal level, having said that, my experience of war as a child, yeah, whilst it hasn't maimed me, or, yeah, so that tragedy hasn't happened, and then maybe I wouldn't be saying this, I don't know. But my experience of war, to the extent that it was, which did have an impact, we were homeless, we were
Mm.
refugees, we were
You
evacuated,
were traumatized.
I was traumatized, actually taught me something. Not at the time, but it taught me that there is no, um, it taught me not to rest on certainty. And that actually was a gift.
Mm.
It was a gift that some of the, um, and maybe this isn't around anymore, but in my childhood, it was like things seemed to be more fixed. If you
Mm.
lived in this country, it was like this. And there was no real understanding or opening to the shifting sands that take place in different cultures and different nations, and yeah, and so on. And because of the particularly mixed up culture that I lived in, I didn't have that. So
Mm.
my there were certain social, cultural, ideological structures that already had broken open for me, and actually that was a gift.
Yeah, I hear you. I had that experience, not for myself. I was never in a war, but I remember something to do with somebody somewhere in Europe, it was Yugoslavia or somewhere, that actually was seemed to be stable. I'm not sure. Please don't quote me. I'm not a historian in that sense. But there was this, I witnessed a person saying, if you think this is to English people, if you think this is an isolated case and your world is so stable and certain, think again, because that's what I thought. And then this happened. There is no such thing as stability in that sense. Yeah, and it broke something open for me, and when the ego self hears that, it tends to go towards fear. Well, if nothing is certain, if this isn't stable, if it could happen anywhere, then I need to live in fear all the time. But
Mm.
then that goes to the next phase of life, which is, even though it's unstable, even though it's uncertain, am I doomed to live in fear all the time? Or do I have to go somewhere different within myself, not moving around the world, but within myself, to live in a state of fearlessness without denying the truth of the matter? So I agree with you completely. It takes you on, it kind of prepares you for a certain kind of living in uncertainty, which is impermanence as
Yes,
well, of
and
course.
and the the sort of fixation on material accumulation and security and stability, whilst some of that is necessary part of life, yes, and not to be denied, it, yeah, or thrown
Mm.
away. But the fixation on it without any room for maneuver is another prison, and that prison was not there for me. And I see that as a blessing because it's allowed the internal world to be open as well and unfixated to the external world and the internal world. And that has been something that's informed me in life. So I'm just saying that to put it into context that as an individual, each of us, the experiences that come to us are they feed or they nourish or they help us evolve in ways that we can't imagine at the time.
Yes, yes. Okay. I'm just going to conclude, I think, with going back to what you said about when I asked you about how you meet the insults of life, and you talked very well about that. And I think the observation that I have about that, because I wanted you to speak to the your humanity, because you're still living a human life, even though there's been a profound awakening that you teach, that you share, that you talk from, that you talk from that fragrance. Still, there's a humanity left, and I like to give people a window into the fact that there's a humanity still involved, and humanity is not a theoretical, philosophical. I'm talking about the day to day, how one meets the very fabric of life in all of its Western ways or Eastern ways. It doesn't matter, because still there are things happening. And what I hear is that you still experience the ripples within, depending on the degree of the experience, but there's no self that keeps reforming itself around that, because the victim and the self has come undone. And once it's finally come undone, it doesn't come together again. That's the point that I'm hearing you speak of. So then you're just left with the raw bones of how you, as this individuation, meet the experiences of the world in your humanness. That's
That's right.
correct.
Beautifully summarized. Yes. Yes, and what that points to is not that there aren't feelings here. Of
Yeah,
course there are. But even those feelings, irritation may arise, or anger if it's appropriate or not appropriate, or whatever, or sadness or whatever. It arises. But even that's not a problem. It's another ripple. So the self doesn't form itself around that.
that's very strange, isn't it? Because it's almost like, well, you go, well, what's so special about it then? Well, it sounds very ordinary to me. And I think the fine line here is that it is it is actually in many ways, certainly what we're speaking of, very ordinary. But don't get that mixed up with with it not being profound. It's profound and natural. Don't believe the word
Mm.
ordinary. It's profoundly natural.
Yes. It changes your internal environment, which is not something that we can measure or quantify, but it changes your frequency field. It changes an internal environment. Whether that actually has an impact on the cellular, you know, the cells of the body, I think it
Mm.
has. I think
Oh,
we could go on about that. We're not going to in this podcast, but it does change your internal environment, your mental environment, your emotional environment, your cellular environment, your endocrinology endocrinological environment. Yeah, every aspect of the human being and its experience. It's all energy. It just, I think it cleans that up in some ways so that and that has a certain impact. Yeah, it's a kind
oh,
of, one becomes more luminous. Oh, that's why
that's
people are
very
drawn to
interesting.
us. Come on, let's, yeah, people listen. People are drawn, not because we're uh, particularly clever or powerful or any of this. It's the light of being, and it draws others, or it has a sort of impact on your environment. So
Yes,
you can't fabricate that.
I think that is a harmonic. That's a kind of, harmonic that goes into the cells, like you say, into the cells, into the body, into the whole of the immune system. It harmonizes something from the root to the crown and above. And I
That's
think
right.
that's what
Yes.
what you just spoke of, yeah?
That's why we go full circle to the very beginning of this podcast. The words are not what matters. They're pointers. And what really matters and what really yeah, is happening through those words is this frequency, this luminosity of being is imbuing those words or the space between the words. That's why those that get a sense of that without knowing will be drawn to it. And those that are not, that are, is only from the mind and it's logical or rational, it doesn't make sense, they won't. And it doesn't matter. That's just the way it is. What else to do? It can't be helped.
Okay, I think I think there are a million questions that could be opened up, but we're not going to open them up at this moment. I think we're going to leave it there. I think we're complete in this particular conversation, Amoda?
I think that was a beautiful conversation. I
Oh,
think
good.
that's just fine.
Okay, friends, it's a willingness to meet reality without an argument, without resistance, without grasping for certainty. It's the willingness to fall moment to moment into silent awareness. Beautiful words. Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you
Yes.
people, whoever's listening, it touches your heart somewhere and maybe ignites a greater willingness to get closer to the flame. And we'll see you again soon, Amoda. Thank you so much for your wisdom. Many
Thank you.
blessings to you. Namaste to everyone. We'll see you soon. Namaste.
Namaste.